Book 3, Part 12. This is still human territory, Track said, looking at me. Maybe we need to get you some allergic to human medicine. Jackson laughed. I'd like to see you walk into a pharmacy and ask for that. The others laughed at his joke, and I lowered my head, refusing to admit I didn't know what I've never had been inside an actual pharmacy. I knew it was a place to get medicine, but I wasn't about to comment and end up being wrong about what it was really like. Man, I was sheltered. Jackson pulled into a parking spot close to the end of the building, and the 3 bikes pulled up next to us so that they were hidden from the street. Jackson opened his door and jumped out. Cal hopped off his side, and I turned around and sat down to wait. When they came back, Marcus opened the back door and Track got out first. They don't have adjoining rooms, Jackson huffed. Seems humans don't have any need for that. He tossed the wallet back to Phil and shrugged. We got a suite, though. It sleeps 8. Phil nodded and I quickly counted. There were exactly that many of us. Convenient, I chuckled, and Rock smiled at me, his hair still blown all over the place from the ride. We were on the 2nd floor again, but we were halfway down the walkway before we stopped. Rock opened the door and flipped on the light as we walked in. I smiled. It was a lot nicer than the last one. The room was warm, too, and it smelled much cleaner. There was a sitting room with a long couch against one wall. There was an actual entertainment center across from it with a nice-sized TV resting in it. There were 2 stuffed chairs, one on each side of the couch. I walked further in and saw a small kitchen behind a half wall. Rock opened one of the doors to the right and peeked his head in, then moved on to the next one and opened it. I followed. The first room had 2 queen-size beds in it, and the second was smaller and had 2 twin beds. I saw another door and opened it, but it was the bathroom. When I frowned, Rock turned my shoulders and pointed to the couch. It folds out into a bed, he stated. Ah, I chuckled, and then looked back at the bathroom door. We'll go get the bags, Marcus offered, and he and Rock headed out the door. The others took a quick tour, and then Track flopped down in one of the chairs and grabbed the remote. Man, I miss TV. Cal chuckled, and Jackson nodded, plopping on the couch. I don't know how you do it, Cal. You can't miss what you don't have, the owl saw wolf stated, but he watched the screen and moved over, sitting down next to Rock. I check it out when we go into town, though. I smiled, and Phil laughed as he walked out of the larger room. This one has its own bathroom, he stated, and I blinked, walking past him. I hadn't noticed that part. I let out a soft sigh when I saw the shower and reached out, running my hand over the thick plastic curtain. I didn't care that it was tiny. It might as well have been in a palace as much as I had missed it. How are we going to keep that splint dry? I jumped and turned, seeing Phil leaning against the door jamb, smiling. I bit my lower lip and looked down at my arm. We brought extras, Cal hollered from the other room, and my eyes sparkled. When Phil nodded, I bounced on my toes and turned back to the shower. Phil chuckled and stepped up next to me. Keep in mind, this is still a hotel. I can't promise how long the hot water will hold up. I nodded eagerly and he kissed my cheek. Enjoy yourself, he whispered, and I could only nod. As soon as the door clicked shut, I was nearly ripping my clothes off. I smiled when I turned the water on and pulled the curtain around me. Then I moaned loudly when I stepped under the water. I couldn't remember a shower feeling this good. The splint was soaked instantly, but I ignored the weight of it, knowing I shouldn't take it off. Hot water poured down over me, and I lifted my head to enjoy it more. It seemed to seep into my skin and warm me all the way through. Whoever invented the shower should have a statue made in their honor. I turned slowly and let it run down the back of my hair and body. When I finally pushed the hair out of my face and opened my eyes, I gasped and slipped, reaching out and grabbing the wall and curtains to keep from falling. Pain shot through my broken arm, and I yelped. "It's just me," Phil hollered through the steam. "Sorry, I was just putting your things in here." I swallowed hard, seeing his form through the thick curtain. Then I looked down at myself, gasped, and turned around, covering myself with my arms. "I can't see through that," he chuckled. Then I saw the curtain move at the end, and I yelped, nearly plastering myself against the far end. A bottle was set on the edge, and then a white brick. "Shampoo and soap," he laughed, and I swallowed hard, then snorted from the water that went up my nose. I had to move my head to one side to breathe, and waited, not moving, watching the shadow on the other side. "As amusing as this is," came his voice, "I hope you really don't think I would do anything so crass," he stated. When I didn't respond, he chuckled again. "Your bag's here on the floor." Finally, the door closed, and I blew out my breath, then choked when I breathed in another noseful of water. I pushed my hair out of my face and stepped slowly to the end of the tub. There was a bottle of my unscented shampoo sitting on the edge, with a washcloth draped over it. I blinked and then poked my head out of the curtain, keeping it close in front of me. The all-white bathroom was filled with steam, but empty. My duffel bag was on the floor, unopened. I sighed, still a bit in shock, and turned back around, determined to enjoy what hot water might be left. Unfortunately, there wasn't much. By the time I finally got to wash my hair, it was warning me that I was about out of time. The hot water turned warm, and then a bit cooler. I quickly rinsed the shampoo out, washed up, and was shivering by the time I turned it off. I was still smiling when I stepped out, though. "Man, that felt good," I whispered to the empty room. I dried off and was surprised at how soft the towels here were. It was a bit awkward since I could really only use my left hand, but I had finally gotten myself dressed and was toweling dry my hair when there was a knock on the door. I looked at it and stood up, flipping my hair over my head. Another knock, and I called out. Phil's head appeared, and I smiled when he looked me over before stepping in. "Sorry about earlier," he stated. "I didn't think you'd notice me, and I didn't want you to get out and not have anything to put on." I nodded, smiling. "It's okay. I appreciate it." I was wearing a pair of jeans and a soft blue sweater now. He was looking towards my bag. Suddenly, I realized he had seen the fancy underwear Track had bought me, and I bit my lower lip. I had put on a pretty blue set, and hoped he couldn't somehow tell. He looked up at me, and I grabbed the towel and started scrubbing it through my hair. When he took a step closer, I flinched, and he smiled, then pulled open a drawer and lifted out a hairdryer. I gave a nervous smile, and he shook his head. "No, I haven't been in many human motels," he said, misunderstanding my body language. "There's a paper out there that tells us all the nifty little things they have in here." "Ah," I said, setting the towel on the counter. Hopefully my brush was in my bag. I didn't mind using a hotel dryer, but I wasn't about to use somebody else's brush. He seemed to realize that he was standing between me and my bag, and he nodded. "Okay, then." When I only nodded back, he turned and left. I giggled and bent down, deciding maybe I was glad he knew what I might or might not have on under my clothes. It was a bit powerful, and I smiled as I pulled out my brush and started to dry my hair. Finally, I dried off my precious bottle of shampoo, tucked it in my bag, and then decided to leave it on the floor, unzipped even. I chuckled to myself as I opened the door and walked out. I instantly noticed that Rock and Cal were gone when I stepped into the main room. "Food run," Track explained. "Some of us do have to eat," he teased. Aaron jumped up and lifted a wooden box that I recognized. Phil looked at my arm. I had the sleeve of my shirt all the way up to keep the wet splint from soaking it. Luckily, the sweater stretched easily, but the splint was dripping. "Let's get that changed," my wolf stated, and walked me to the small table. Aaron opened the box and Phil sat next to me, then looked at Track. "I need a towel." My best friend jumped up from the couch and came back with one of the white, soft hand towels. Phil unwound the thick gauze material and then removed the 2 pieces of curved wood. It felt so good to have the air on it, and he was very gentle as he dried off my arm. "The swelling is already down," he said as he dabbed the towel over my arm. The bruises were pretty bad, but I nodded, explaining that it didn't hurt nearly as bad either, which was true. My body was so happy after that shower that my arm seemed minor now. Aaron unscrewed a jar and held it out. "This is to rub on before the splint," he stated. Phil scooped some of the paste out and gently rubbed it into my arm. I moaned softly and he looked up at me. "It feels good," I smiled. "It makes it warm and soaks into the muscles and bone." I shrugged and he nodded and continued to work the concoction into my skin. Aaron handed him a new splint and he slid it under my forearm. I nodded when it was in place and then he wrapped it. I was surprised to see this one had Velcro at the end, and he rubbed it in place and then slid his finger under the end to make sure it wasn't too tight. Aaron was packing everything up when there was a knock on the door and Cal called out. Track hopped up and answered the door, then moaned as he smelled the food. "I can still smell the humans here," I whispered, and Phil looked at me. I shrugged. "This place is much cleaner, but—" He nodded. "This is a human motel, and even humans clean it." When I nodded back, Track leaned into my face. "Well, since you aren't sneezing, it seems you're just allergic to filth." I rolled my eyes and he chuckled and plopped down at the table, pulling food out of a bag. Jackson handed Phil a bag and I smiled and moved over to the couch to give them more room. Phil took his bag, grabbed his drink, and came and sat down next to me. I smiled at him and laid my head on his shoulder and watched TV as he ate. An hour later I was curled up next to him. Track's head was in my lap. Rock was sitting on the floor, leaning back against my legs, and the others were sprawled out between the rest of the couch and the chairs. We were watching what humans call horror show, and we were laughing hysterically in parts. So when someone knocked on the door, it took a split second for anyone to react. Then all heck broke loose, quietly. Jackson jumped up, grabbed my good arm, and ran me into the first bedroom. He stayed in with me, but shut the door. This time, I didn't argue. We were all here, and I knew Ryan would have to call to find out where we were. We both stood by the door, though, leaning close to it and listening, with our foreheads almost touching. My eyes widened when I heard a female's voice, and Jackson wiggled his brows at me. I frowned and tried to listen. "It's a lot of fun," I heard her say. She sounded nervous and excited at the same time. "We're gonna head down there right now." My brows rose higher. That was a different female voice. I looked at the door and Jackson shook his head at me. I gave a very soft growl and he winked, blowing me a silent kiss. I rolled my eyes and put my ear against the door, only to hear the front door shut. Jackson barely waited for me to move before flinging it open and rushing out. When I walked in, I noticed that Rock and Cal were grinning, but the others weren't. Track shook his head. Seemed some females downstairs saw us all pull in and thought they would invite us to the local hangout. I bit my lower lip to keep from smiling, and he frowned. It's not funny, Ray. We don't need that kind of attention. Wow, was this coming from Track? I shrugged. Well, who could blame them? Small town, 7 hot guys pulling up, 3 on motorcycles. I shrugged again, and Rock smiled. Phil turned to him, and he put his hands up. Hey, I know. If all of this wasn't going on, I would be begging. But I know. Then the phone rang, and we all froze. It wasn't the hotel phone. Phil yanked something out of his pocket, looked at the screen, and hit a button. We all moved closer, and I smiled as I heard Ryan's voice on the other end. Which direction? Phil smiled at me. Head south on that main road by the fence, then west, was all he said. I frowned and went to open my mouth, but Track shook his head hard and put a finger to his lips. I shook my head, knowing that wasn't the way we went. But Phil winked at me, and I held my tongue. Then Phil hung up. Why did you tell him the wrong directions? I snapped. It's a code, Jackson explained, and I turned to look at him. In case someone else was listening, Track stated, speaking slowly like I was a small child. My eyes widened, and he nodded. Wow, that was impressive. At least he's on his way, Rock stated, and I nodded, still in awe of their secret system. When did they come up with that? We all settled back down to watch TV. This time, Phil kept the cell phone next to him. About an hour later, it rang again. Phil gave some more of his odd directions and then hung up. Finally, I asked. Operation Kidnap Raina, Jackson answered, and I balked. Phil smiled. We came up with it when we came to get you. Oh, I replied, and then frowned. He kissed my cheek and pulled me back to him, where my head was on his shoulder. I smiled and inhaled slowly. I closed my eyes and listened to his heartbeat while the others watched the rest of some show about building motorcycles from parts in a junkyard. One more call and one more set of odd instructions. This time Rock and Marcus jumped up and Phil nodded. Get a phone out of the bag, he stated, and I sat up so he could stand. What's going on? I asked. We're going to go meet Brian, Rock stated, pulling on his coat. Cal jumped up and offered to go, and Phil nodded, handing Marcus a cell phone. I watched the 3 of them leave and then heard the motorcycles start. It's like a spy movie, I thought out loud, and Jackson plopped next to me, putting his arm around my shoulder. I'm very spy-like too, you know. I rolled my eyes and he leaned closer to my ear. I have moves that... He grunted and disappeared as Phil yanked him off the couch and took his spot. I giggled this time, laid down, and put my head in his lap. Then I grunted as my legs were lifted and Track sat down, dropping them back over his own lap. Phil chuckled and reached down, softly stroking my hair. Rock sat down and finished some of his food, and Aaron joined him at the table. Phil's touch felt so good, and I closed my eyes as he rubbed my head and hair. It was relaxing, and I started to nod off from it. You're putting her to sleep, Rock pointed out, and I blinked my eyes open. And your point is? Phil replied with a soft growl. Rock shrugged. I was just saying. Then he took a bite of his food and turned back to the table. I giggled into Phil's leg, and he sighed. We all jumped up when we heard motorcycles outside. Track cussed under his breath and bolted out the door without his coat. Rock locked the door behind him, and Phil handed me to Aaron and pointed to the back bathroom. I balked, and he nodded. No windows or doors. Aaron took my good hand, and we hurried to the far bathroom, where he closed and locked the door. Okay, this wasn't awkward at all. The light was off, and our wolf eyes adjusted quickly. I didn't know Aaron very well, and now we were locked in a small bathroom together. in the dark.